Hey guys, Mr. Edwards here, Centreville High School Automotive Technology. Today we're going to be going over how to properly service the front disc brakes on a vehicle. We have our 1996 Toyota Camry here. It needs some front brakes done to it, so we're going to go over the procedure for disassembling, servicing, and reassembling front disc brakes properly. Okay, so we've got our front disc brakes on this Toyota Camry. As you can see, the pads, well, there's not much left to them. So we're going to be servicing the brakes on this car. The first thing that you guys need to do, obviously, is get the wheel off the car, which we've already done. Make sure the car is supported properly with jack stands and a floor jack or on a lift. To get the first part of the brakes apart, we need to take off the caliper here. So this braking system right here has what's called a floating caliper system. This is your caliper. It's bolted up to the bracket that the brake pads are inside of. The caliper floats back and forth when the piston comes in and out on the slide pins. There's one up top here and one down on the bottom. The bolts that go through the slide pin are what we need to take off to be able to get the caliper off of the bracket. One other tip for you guys, because of where all the bolts are at for the brakes on here, being on the back coming towards you, it's helpful to be able to give yourself as much access as possible. The best way to do that is to turn the wheel. Turn it as far as you can to whatever direction the caliper is on so that you can get as good access as possible to those bolts. Because if it's pointing straight ahead like this, you're having to fight back here to be able to access those bolts. So I'm going to turn the wheel all the way to the right because we're over here on the passenger side, and I got better access to those bolts now. These two bolts that need to come out on the top and bottom of the caliper that go through the slide pin, they're both 14 millimeter bolts. Not all brakes are going to have the same size bolts. You got to figure out what size you need for the car that you're working on. So get your 14 millimeter socket and ratchet for this one. Get up in here. Now, one thing to keep in mind, because of how these bolts come in and that they're coming from the back, remember, lefty-loosey, and loosening on this, it helps if you take your ratchet first and make sure you're loosening and it's clicking when you're going to the right, lefty-loosey, because it's going to seem like you're tightening it when you're looking at it because the bolt's coming towards you. Get up in here, and they will be tight. Give it some muscle. It should pop loose, and you should be able to spin the bolts out. Same thing on the bottom one. Pop the bolt loose, and they should come out pretty easy. Now, I've got my two slide pin bolts out, and I'm going to keep everything organized for this car because the bolts that we're going to take out next are much bigger. We don't want to mix anything up. So I'm setting these off to the side on the floor here. We do not want to mix anything up. Back here on the car, now that we've got our slide pin bolts out, we can grab the caliper, wiggle it around some, and it'll come off. Now, we need to be careful here because the only thing that's holding this caliper now is the hose that comes off of it that the brake fluid goes into it on. This is a rubber hose. It is not meant to support the weight of the caliper, which is solid metal. You do not want to just let go of this caliper and let it dangle on this rubber hose. So we need to take something to hook the caliper up and support it. What I like to use is a little hook. This used to be a coat hanger. I cut it and bent it. It works perfectly for this. You guys can use a bungee cord. They actually sell hooks that are meant for this purpose. They sell caliper hooks if you want to spend the money on it, or just take an old coat hanger like me. Hook it through the caliper like that, and now I'm going to take it and hook it up on the strut up inside the suspension there. Up out of my way. Like so. Now, hooked up to the strut, my caliper's nice and supported, not going to fall or go anywhere, and there's no weight on my brake hose. Back down here at my brakes now, I got my caliper off. These are my brake pads, my inner brake pad and my outer brake pad that are sitting inside the bracket here up against the rotor. Now I need to get this bracket off of here. So there's two more bolts in the back, one up on top, one down here on the bottom that you can see. Those are bigger bolts, and they are 17 millimeters. So we're going to take our ratchet and socket again, get up in there, and get those bolts broken loose. And with a little bit of muscle, they come loose. Again, these bolts are coming towards you, so you want to make sure you're turning in the correct direction. These bolts, again, are going to be pretty tight because they're holding the whole brakes together. You do not want your brakes coming loose going down the road. Same thing on the bottom. And again, with some muscle, it'll come loose. Now I'm going to take both these bolts, back them all the way out. And once I've got both these bolts out of here, my bracket and my brake pads will come off together. Set those off to the side, organize my bolts up here so we don't lose anything. Now, my rotor just popped off. A lot of times rotors are rusted on really good. They rust up to the hub that's behind them that you're going to see in a minute. But this one right here, as soon as I took my bracket off, the rotor just popped loose. I'm going to go ahead and pull my rotor off now, give it a little wiggle, off it comes. Okay, so let's take a look at everything we've got here. So we have our caliper nice and supported and hung up there. We're going to service that in a minute. Down here on the ground we have our bracket and our brake pads. They have our slide pins inside of it as well, and our brake rotor. So before we go any further with cleaning things up, putting our new brake pads in, we've got to do something with this rotor here, because take a look at it. It's rusty, it's crusty. See how the metal's kind of gray looking? That's heat glazing from the heat, the friction of the brakes. We've got to do something about that. We can't put nice brand new brake pads on here with a rotor that looks like that. So we've got two options. We can either replace the rotors, which new rotors, depending on the quality you get, can be $40, $50, $60 or more each, or we can resurface the rotor. Now, in order to be able to resurface the rotor, there has to be enough metal left on the rotor. So when we were doing our brake inspection on this car a couple days ago, we measured the rotors with a digital caliper. And if you guys remember, there was plenty of metal, a couple millimeters of metal left on this rotor to be able to resurface it. So that's what we're going to do. This is what the rotor looks like now and after. Now, we took our rotor here and resurfaced it on a brake lathe, which means this is the same rotor that we just took off. We put it on a machine and cut a new surface in the metal. Cleaned up all that dark gray glazing that was on it from the friction and the heat. Took out any uneven measurements that were in it. And that procedure for cutting rotors, resurfacing them, is going to be in a video that's coming up soon. For now, let's go ahead and get these brakes put back together with our nice resurfaced rotor and our new brake pads. Back here on the car, before we can put our nice resurfaced rotor back on the hub here, we need to clean up this hub face here that's got all the rust on it. You can see chunks falling off. And the way that we're going to do that is by using a wire brush. Now, this could be contaminated with dust and dirt, stuff that we don't want to get out in the air and be breathing. So before we go ahead and wire brush it down and clean it up, we're going to spray it with some brake cleaner. Brake cleaner, it's the same stuff we've used to clean up oil, and it's a solvent. You know, it just dissolves anything that is a potential contaminant. So spray that on there real good, then take a nice hard bristled wire brush and come in here, and we're just going to clean up our hub surface real good. The reason that we're doing this is because we don't want our rotor that is nice and cleaned up now to not sit flush onto the hub. We want to take off any chunks of metal or anything that could cause it to be sitting on here at an angle. Now that our hub's nice and cleaned up, we can go ahead and mount our rotor back on it. And the way that we're going to do that is by just sliding it straight back over the wheel studs. And now, see how it wants to tilt back out towards me? When I go and put my bracket back on and my caliper and everything, I don't want to be fighting this rotor trying to fall off the car. So my best tip to you to prevent that is to take one of the lug nuts and come down here. Notice the part that's sitting furthest out is the bottom of the rotor. So come down here to one of the studs that's on the bottom or closest to the bottom of the rotor and spin this lug nut on here. Make sure the rotor's sitting all the way up on the hub. Just tighten that lug nut up by hand. I'll just tighten it up with my fingers. Now the rotor's not going to go anywhere. Now that we have our rotor back on the car, we need to clean up our caliper bracket here, get these old brake pads out of here. That way we can put our new pads in, have everything moving nice and smooth. We need to clean these slide pins up so when we go to put it back on the car, the new brake pads go in nice and easy. So with my caliper bracket, first thing I'm going to do is take my old brake pads out of it. They just pop out, and pay attention to which one was the inside brake pad and which one was the outside. Don't mix them up, because if you're just cleaning your brakes and you're going to put the same brake pads back in, you want to put them back on the correct side, and we might have to compare them to our new brake pads if we're replacing them like we are with ours. That way we're making sure that we put the correct new brake pad on the correct side. Usually the inside brake pad is going to have an impression in it where the caliper piston, or pistons in this case, were making contact with it. So that's a good way to keep them organized. Set these off to the side. Next thing I'm going to do is take my slide pins out of the caliper bracket here. Now, these slide pins should move nice and free. See how this one slides back and forth? This one here, I can't move it. If you have a stuck or seized slide pin like this, that is a very quick way to have your brake pads not be able to move freely and wear them out prematurely. We need to clean these up so that they both move nice and free. Don't mix these up. We're going to take them out one at a time, because usually one of them has a little rubber bushing in it like that, and we don't want to put it on the wrong end of the caliper bracket. The way that we clean these up, we're just going to wipe them off real good with a rag, get any grease, dirt, dust, whatever's on them off of them. And then we're going to use some brake grease, or in this case by Nissan, it's PVC grease. Same thing, at school we have what's called Moly Lube brake grease, same stuff. It's a special type of grease that's meant for braking applications. We're going to use some of it to grease up these slide pins so they move nice and free. So a small coating of brake grease on our slide pin. We don't need to put 3 inches of the stuff on the slide pins, just a nice coating all the way around it. Slide it back in. Make sure it's moving nice and free. And we'll do the same thing with the other slide pin, and because this one's stuck, it might be hard to get out of there. Notice how this one doesn't have that rubber bushing in it. We don't want to mix them up. Again, wipe it off real good. Because this one was kind of stuck, I'm going to take a closer look at it and make sure that it doesn't have any pitting or anything in it where it was kind of rusted in place. It looks nice and clean. All it needs is to be cleaned up. Again, a nice coating of our brake grease on there, just a thin coating all the way around. Put it back into the bracket. Make sure it moves nice and free now. See the difference there from before when it wouldn't move to where now it moves back and forth? Same thing with this one. Now, the next thing that I need to do now that I've cleaned up my slide pins is clean up the clips where the brake pads ride inside the caliper bracket. Some new brake pads are going to come with new clips that go in here, and they're easy to replace. All you do, pop the old ones out, throw them away, put the new ones in. Our brake pads did not come with new clips for the inside, so we've got to clean these ones up. These clips have dirt and dust all over them that we don't want to have going out in the air and breathing, just like when we cleaned up our hub face on the car. So we're going to spray these down real good, and the whole bracket anywhere real good with brake clean, and then wire brush them off. So before it looked like this, all dirty and with dust and grease all over it. After, we want it to look like this, nice shiny clean metal where our nice new brake pads can ride on it. Now I'm going to do the same thing to the other end of the bracket because we want both ends nice and cleaned up. So now that our bracket is all nice and cleaned up, ready for our new brake pads, we need to get our caliper ready to go back on the car as well, and then we can start reassembling everything. So with our caliper, you guys can see how the pistons are out on it right now, and that's how it'll be when you disassemble it. We need to push those pistons back in so that there's space to accommodate our new brake pads, because our new brake pads obviously are going to be much wider than our old brake pads were because they have much more braking material on them. So to push those pistons back in, there's a couple different methods you can use. What I'm going to use is a special tool that's meant for doing this, and it's a brake caliper depressing tool. You squeeze the handle on it and it pushes out to push those pistons back in. I'll show you guys how I'm going to do that. Or if you don't have a special tool like my caliper depressing tool, you could use just a big pair of rib joint channel lock pliers to get up in there and squeeze the pistons back in. Although that might be a little bit difficult on a 2-piston system like this caliper. So with this caliper having 2 pistons on it, we're going to have to use either a special tool that covers both these pistons and pushes them both back in equally, or make our own special tool of sorts. Because I don't have here at home a caliper depressor that fits onto a dual piston system, I just have one for a single piston, we're going to have to kind of modify it to work. And the way that we're going to do that is take one of the old brake pads and set it in here. That way we don't damage either of our piston surfaces. And then we're going to come in here with our caliper depressing tool. I'm using one finger to hold that brake pad in there till I get the tool on it. The way that our tool works, and you guys will see this in a second, it fits inside the caliper like that. Make sure our brake pad is lined up on both those pistons. And now as I squeeze the trigger, it's going to push the pistons in. So I switched sides with it. That way I made sure both pistons were pushed all the way in evenly. Now they are. My brake pad that I'm using as my tool adapter is all the way down and flush. The way that I get this tool out of here, there's a little black handle on the back of it that I have to squeeze. It lets my tool retract back, and now my pistons are pushed all the way in. Back down here at the brakes, we're going to take our nice cleaned up bracket, slide it back in place, and then get the bolts that bolt the bracket on. Remember, I had my bolts nice and organized over here so I didn't mix them up. Start the top bolt. Always, always, always start bolts by hand, guys. Never ever with a tool, because otherwise you might get them in sideways and mess up the threads, cross thread them. Start my bottom bolt. They went in nice and smooth. And I'm just going to tighten them all the way down as far as I can get them by hand, and then we'll finish them with a tool and tighten them as tight as we need to get them. So now that they're as tight as I can get them with my fingers, I got my ratchet, and remember these were 17 millimeters. I'm going to make sure that I'm tightening, not loosening. Again, with the bolts coming from the back, it kind of goes against logic. It feels like you're going to the left, but really you're tightening because the bolt's coming towards you. So make sure we're going righty-tighty to tighten them up. Come back here. And get them good and tight as we can get them by hand. Same thing on the bottom, as tight as we can get it by hand. So now that the bracket's on and tight, I got my new brake pads here, and we can get them ready to go on the car as well. I want to make sure not to touch the braking surface here with anything that's contaminated with grease or anything, because I don't want to get any sort of contaminants on what's going to be my braking surface. So on some cars, the inside and the outside brake pad are going to be different from each other. One of them might have a little metal wear clip on it, and you want to make sure you put the correct brake pad on the correct side. For this car, both brake pads are the exact same, so we can just put them on. Before I put my pads on, though, I need to get them greased up, because we're going to have metal-to-metal contact in several points on our pads, and we want to have lubrication on there so that the pads move nice and smoothly. For this lubrication, again, we're going to use the same PVC brake grease. At school, we'd be using Moly Lube. Same thing, it's a high-temperature brake grease. So the contact points of my brake pad are going to be the ears on each end of it, and then the backing plate of it. So I'm going to come to the ears here and put a small coating of grease all the way around the ears where they'll make contact with the bracket. I don't need to put, again, 3 inches of the stuff on there, just a nice small coating of grease, just enough to lubricate it. I need to be really careful not to get any grease on the braking surface, because that can damage our nice new braking material there. Same thing on the other end, the other ear. A small coating of grease. And on the backing plate. I don't need to put a ton back here, just enough for where it makes contact with either the bracket or the piston of the caliper. Now my brake pad's nice and greased up at all the contact points, and I'm going to do the same thing to the opposite brake pad, of course. So now both of my brake pads are nice and greased up at all their contact points. They're ready to get installed on the car. So again, some cars, the inside and the outside brake pad are very specific as to what side they need to be on, and you'll need to compare those with the old brake pads to be sure that yours aren't side specific. With mine, both the old brake pads that came off this side looked exactly the same, and both the new ones going on look exactly the same. To put the brake pads in, it helps to start at kind of an angle like this, slide them in, and then they'll just slide up inside the bracket, similar to how the old ones came out. Just like that. The inside can be a little bit trickier because you got to kind of look in from it backwards. I'll move you guys over there so you can see. And now you guys will be able to see me install my inside brake pad here. Again, I usually start at a little bit of an angle like this. Get behind it, wiggle on it, and it'll pop into place just like that. Now with my brake pads installed, I'm ready to reinstall my caliper. So I need to come up here and unhook it from its little hook that's holding it, keeping any weight off of our brake hose. Don't leave this hook hanging up on the car. I've done that myself, and I've known many people that have done it. And if it comes flying off at 60 miles an hour, it's not good for the person that's behind you. Back down here, it should be pretty easy to just slide my caliper in place. You might have to wiggle the slide pins around a little bit to make sure they're all the way in so the caliper can sit down on there. But it should be easy to get it just set back down if you push your pistons in all the way. Now I'll grab my bolts over here for the caliper, and again, start them by hand. Don't start them with a tool or anything like that, because we do not want to damage our threads inside the slide pins. Start the top one, come down here and start the bottom one. With both these bolts in, I'll tighten them up as far as I can get them by hand, and then get my ratchet over here to tighten them up as tight as we need to get them. Again, make sure you're tightening. These were 14 millimeter. Tight. And tight. Now, at this point, with everything put back together, your caliper's back on, your bracket's back on, all your brakes are together. If we were in the shop at school, you would call me over because I need to double check these bolts. Brakes are not something we can play games with, guys. And somebody's going 60 miles an hour and somebody cuts them off, they need to be able to stop. And I need to double check you guys just to make sure that we're all on the same page and we're not going to have anybody's brakes come flying apart going down the road. Once I've checked the bolts and I'm happy that everything's all good, you would go ahead and put the wheel back on here. To do that, obviously, you're going to have to take that lug nut back off, put the wheel back on, torque it by hand. I can't stress enough how important that is either, because the number one way that you can damage rotors, especially after you've put a lot of effort into cleaning them up real nice or spent money on replacing them, is to not properly torque your wheels, because it'll pull on the studs unevenly and damage your rotor. And obviously I did the exact same thing over on the driver's side of the car as well. We've got a nice resurfaced rotor, nice brand new brake pads, everything's greased up. This side's good to go as well. We never do brakes on just one wheel. If we're replacing the brakes, we have to do at least the same axle. We have to do both fronts or both rears. We can't do brakes on just one wheel of the car. Now I've got my brakes replaced. I'm going to come over here, get in the car, start it up. Ooh, before I go anywhere, this is critical, guys. you need to pump up the brake pedal. If you've just done brakes on a car and you've pushed the caliper pistons in like we did, when you first get in the car and try and move it, if you step on the brake pedal, you will have no brakes. The pedal will go straight to the floor. That's because that piston's not making any contact with the brake pads. You need to get in the car, start it up, pump the brake pedal until it feels normal. For the first few times, it's going to feel like you have no brakes, and you don't want to be moving with no brakes. Pump up the brake pedal. Alright guys, so we got nice new brakes on this Toyota Camry here now. We resurfaced the rotors, which you guys will see in an upcoming video, and we got nice new pads on the car. Hope you guys learned something from this video. We do a lot of brakes in the shop at school, so this should be something that you really take note of, because you will be doing brakes, I guarantee you, when we get back to school. Make sure you guys pack up all your tools when you're done, obviously. Fill out your reflection sheet that goes along with the video you just watched. I look forward to seeing you guys soon, and thanks for watching.